Half a century ago, in my first year of graduate school at Berkeley, I came face to face with Talcott Parsons' massive 2 volumes on the structure of social action. Most of those 800 pages need not concern us. But his opening quote of Crane Brinton, "Who now reads Spencer?" I read as a challenge and immediately went to look up Herbert Spencer. Thanks to the privilege of exploring the closed stacks of the Bancroft Library, in an original 1852 volume of the Westminster Review, I discovered a little-known article published by Spencer without attribution to his name. In A Theory of Population Deduced from the General Law of Animal Fertility, Spencer crystallized his view that population growth inevitably results from our biological nature as human beings. From the beginning, he tells us, pressure of population has been the proximate cause of progress. When I read that 1852 article, I can't help seeing a Monty Python animation of Herbert Spencer looking the wrong way through a telescope, because his population pressure engine driving social progress got everything exactly backwards. He was not the first to make this mistake, nor was he the last. Malthus himself made the same error, supposing that pressure of population has been a timeless fact of human nature. Of course, we do have biological natures as human beings, but this does not include any inevitable pressure for exponential population growth. In fact, quite the reverse. Here we must take for our own what is usually called the poet's task, to make the familiar seem strange. Just consider some of the reproductive liabilities of our human species. First, other mammals experience strong physiological and behavioral effects of hormonal cycles. Cat and dog owners know how oestrus, or heat, concentrates receptivity to intercourse closely around ovulation. Among humans, though, physiological and behavioral features of estrus somehow have weakened nearly to the vanishing point. We might even say that in humans, receptivity to intercourse has become permanent, scattering sexual activity all over the calendar and reducing the chance that any particular contact results in conception. Second, consider the gestational period for human births. Length of gestation among mammals correlates with size of the infant at birth. An elephant is pregnant for about 2 years, but at the end of that time you get a baby elephant. A cat is pregnant for about 2 months, and a mouse for only about 20 days. Humans are pregnant for 9 months, but so are cows, and a calf is much larger than a human newborn. In fact, a human female stays pregnant longer than a moose, a hippopotamus, or a grizzly bear. Our species stands far out from the regression line of gestation on mass of newborns. This abnormally long gestation further reduces our reproductive potential, even when conception does occur. It turns out there's a good reason for this outlier status. Gestational duration relates more precisely to brain weight of newborns than to total body mass, and human infants have unusually large brains. Those large brains create a third reproductive problem for our species, though, because one look at the difference between our hands and our feet shows that we also like to walk around erect, unlike other primates. Anthropologist Sherwood Washburn famously highlighted this contradiction within humanity, pointing out that when humans straightened up vertically and walked erect, our pelvic bones rotated inward and drastically reduced the diameter of the birth canal. How do you get a large-brained infant through a narrowed birth canal? All sorts of strange compromises result. The entire human species basically is born premature, a crowd of almost totally helpless infants who can't roll over, sit up, or do anything at all except wave their limbs and scream for help. Unless they get that help immediately and then constantly for years afterward, they remain terribly vulnerable. It was Sherwood Washburn again who observed that in nature, even among primates, the first year of life after birth is a year of slaughter, with risks of loss typically up to 1/3 of all births. Infant mortality approached this level in human populations as well until very recently in historical time. Weakened estrus, long gestation, helpless infants, an animal with so many reproductive liabilities should face the opposite of population pressure. All in all, an alien observer looking down from a flying saucer at our earliest human ancestors would not have given such a strange species much chance of survival in a world of lions and tigers and bears. And yet here we all are, and more of us by the minute. The key to our survival as a species also sprang from those large brains. Working in groups, we constructed social bubbles of culture that, among other things, compensated for our long laundry list of reproductive liabilities as a species. We enshrined marriage and kinship rules at the core of all traditional cultures to keep men and women in long-term intimate contact so that sex coincides with ovulation whenever it occurs, and to care for helpless infants through their long maturation process. All other aspects of life were subordinated to and coordinated with this core of roles and relationships centered on reproduction. Bernard Farber, writing just in time for me to find his book back then, described two orthogonal dimensions of this consanguine family system: the dominant dimension of kinship and a subordinate dimension of marriages linking kinship lineages to one another, controlled and defined by those occupying positions of power in the kinship system. The dominance of the kinship dimension eloquently illustrates the primary purpose of this system: to ensure, even to compel, reproduction. The subordinate place of marriage and related affinal ties guarantees that people forming such ties will obey the reproductive imperatives dictated by powerful kinship groups. Claude Lévi-Strauss illustrated this reproductive social order with a simple example. In an Amazonian tribe he studied, only men could catch fish, but only women could cook fish. If you want to eat fish, the men and women have to get together. One day, walking through the forest, he and the headman of the tribe observed a sad-looking solitary figure skulking along some distance away among the trees. Lévi-Strauss asked, "Is that fellow some kind of outcast or criminal? He looks miserable." "Oh, no," replied the headman, "he's just a bachelor." At the heart of every human culture that has survived and persisted through history and prehistory, we find the same intense preoccupation with what Judith Blake called reproductive coercion, a social insurance policy in the face of uncontrolled mortality and our reproductive liabilities. Some human cultures may not have indoctrinated themselves to pair off and make lots of babies as soon as possible, rewarding those who do with public praise, increased social status, even religious endorsement. But if such cultures ever arose, they're long gone. Reproductive coercion ranks among the earliest, most important, most successful, and most widespread of all inventions ever devised by the human species. Reproductive coercion uses negative as well as positive reinforcement. Denial of full adult status to people who don't reproduce, and stigmatization and persecution of people who don't conform to rigid gender roles show the flip side of the celebration of successful parents and families playing by the pronatal rules. But this reproductive coercion is not human nature in the same way as erect posture, a narrow birth canal, or a large brain. The very fact that all surviving traditional cultures spend so much elaborate time and effort training people to believe and fulfill these traditions shows that such norms cannot be innate. You don't have to teach people that they need to sleep. You don't have to teach people that it's time to go through puberty. In contrast, people do have to learn a language, a religion, or a set of rules and beliefs about family life, all arbitrary and varying parts of that bubble of culture we invented to improve our chances of survival. By the middle of the 20th century, Kingsley Davis and Judith Blake finally gave us a clear expression of the insight that social structure determines all human fertility. Traditional cultures stimulate high birth rates, just as surely as cultural change may lead to low birth rates. Now we see plainly the error of Malthus and Spencer and everyone else who claimed that rapid population growth was built right into the biological nature of humanity. They all referred to populations already living inside that carefully crafted bubble of culture, that seamless web of reproductive coercion. Looking through the wrong end of the demographic telescope, many scholars fell victim to the classic confusion between nature and nurture, between locked-in biological features of a species and invented social solutions to our reproductive handicaps. Comparatively recently, though, we suddenly unbalanced the demographic near equilibrium painstakingly built up over scores of millennia. Today, for a rising share of humanity, the Grim Reaper no longer stalks among us as a daily companion. Instead of several hundred out of every 1,000 births dying in the first year of life, today in many countries, infant deaths have dropped to single digits per 1,000 births. Saving lives is always popular because uncontrolled mortality was a fact of nature for humanity, not an artificial social result. No intense beliefs in traditional cultural institutions stand in the way of lowering death rates. It is true in one sense that the death rate never really changes. It is always 1 to a customer. But in demography, as in vaudeville, the key is timing. More than 1/4 of Americans died before age 15 just 100 years ago. In contrast, today less than 1/4 of us have died by age 65. If you die before age 15, you probably never reproduce. If you've survived to age 65, you've probably done all the reproducing you could manage in response to the pronatal encouragement of your culture. Extending our expected length of life, we have controlled the specter of untimely death so thoroughly that all this cultural machinery we created to encourage babies has become a problem. Where reproductive coercion remains strong, it no longer saves us from extinction. Instead, it forces upon us a flood of babies who nearly all grow up demanding food and health care and jobs and places to live and mobile phones. Where all that cultural machinery still propels women to bear an average of 5, 6, 7, or even more children, we find half of such a country's entire population below age 14 or even younger, and we see that population doubling in size with every new generation. Such societies are drowning in an ever-increasing demographic flood and often spilling out waves of refugees from the resulting chaos. There is only one way to slow such growth: to rebalance new low death rates with equally low birth rates to slow the flood of babies. The cultural machinery must be shifted down from high gear to something sustainable. You might try to force people to conform to new laws restricting reproduction, as attempted in China over the past 3/4 of a century. However, using new coercive force to counteract existing reproductive coercion doesn't make people happy. Quite the contrary. Piling more coercion on top of existing coercion just makes people frustrated and resentful. We need to subtract from the list of prescribed attitudes and actions we impose on one another, not add more commands to that list. But here, unlike the situation with death rates, we do encounter intense allegiance to traditional cultural beliefs that do stand in the way of lowering birth rates. Kingsley Davis once wrote that anyone who suggests changing the institution of the family usually is judged either wicked or a fool. Powerful people with a vested interest in the old status quo do not like you to tinker with their most cherished relationships. How do we free ourselves from reproductive coercion when some people still equate it with moral virtue? It turns out that actually we don't have to worry about dismantling the ancient pronatal cultural machinery urging us to produce floods of babies. Our scholarly hand-wringing, our deliberate policies and projects to interfere in people's lives and convince them to have fewer children amount to running along beside a wagon already rolling downhill. The ancient pronatal cultural framework is unraveling spontaneously all around us, part of a tectonic shift in the most fundamental basis of social organization and order. All we really need to do is step out of the way of that rolling wagon. It is instructive to look around the world at places that already have downshifted their cultural machinery to slower reproductive speeds without draconian direct controls on reproductive behavior. In every society where birth rates remain high, ancient pronatal arrangements make children valuable assets for their families, what economists call producer goods. Children provide material security, wealth, and social prestige to families. In contrast, in every society where birth rates fall to low levels, children somehow have been transformed from wealth-generating producer goods into expensive consumer goods. Parents still pay the bills of raising children, but no longer get to claim the wealth those children eventually produce. Newly differentiated institutions based on material production, ranging from invention of the limited liability joint stock corporation to political crystallization of a jealous rabble of nation-states jostling for control of the world's map, crowd out the ancient reproductive basis of social order. The wealth produced by each new generation now goes into the pockets of these new players, diverted away from traditional channels defined by kinship ties. No wonder people have fewer children. In 1937, Kingsley Davis observed that, quote, modern society, characterized by a high degree of urbanization based upon an elaborate industrial technology and maintained through a great amount of geographical and social mobility, is by its very nature destructive of the family. Its institutions not based on kinship, and its dominant motif not familistic, the farther it moves in the direction of its own genius, the farther it moves away from the family. Unquote. Today, neither we nor our relatives become wealthy by having many children. Neither we nor they face destitution if we have no children at all. Other dimensions of social life not based on kinship increasingly determine each person's life chances. Our relatives have neither the power nor the motivation to decide who and when we should marry. To mark achievement of adult status by marriage or parenthood begins to seem quaint and out of date. We attain adult status not by finding a spouse and having babies, but by finding a job, making money, and buying things. Our roles in economic production mostly involve interactions with people who are not our relatives and bind us to new non-kin-based actors and groups. These new patterns of economic production break down key parts of the ancient pronatal machinery, despite the objections of patriarchs still presiding over traditional kin-based social arrangements, and we respond by having fewer children. We lose our former urgency about marriage itself and about following rigid gender roles that once linked marriage to reproduction. In fact, in a world that defines each individual above all as an economic producer and consumer, we make rules against nepotism and forbid all questions about gender preference, marital status, and reproductive intentions or accomplishments on job applications. Such topics are not just irrelevant. As remnants of social life defined by reproductive relationships, they become illegitimate concerns when it comes to evaluating individuals for economically productive roles, clearly illustrating the grim efficiency with which social order organized around economic production systematically drives out and replaces reproductive social order. Only a tiny elite of the most powerful families manage to keep their kin-based connections above the rising tide of the new system through inheritance of vast accumulated wealth, but they're too few to have much effect on the demographic patterns in society. How should we feel about this fundamental shift from reproduction to economic production as the basis for social order? We may celebrate new diversity in gender identities and anticipate the collapse of patriarchal authority as a welcome cultural springtime in which new individual freedoms will blossom. Just don't forget that regimentation of identity and hierarchies of authority merely shift from one institutional context to another, depending on where the big decisions are made. Gender identities may gain new flexibility and fluidity, but your formal schooling, income, and occupation define your life chances ever more sharply. Being married becomes less important, but being employed becomes more important, and work does not always make you free. Your relatives may no longer force you into a straitjacket of reproductive roles, but other actors out there are crafting new forms of regimentation based on the new roles that matter in this brave new world. For example, every year, people choose marriage partners who match themselves more closely in educational attainment. It seems to me that even as social scientists, we spend too much time noticing the froth of events troubling the stormy surface of contemporary society. We would do well to notice that below the surface flow deeper, more consequential currents. One of the strongest, already flowing for generations and likely to continue through many future generations, is transforming humanity from a species with uncontrolled high mortality and matching high fertility artificially stimulated by pronatal cultural traditions into a low mortality species able to extend an expected lifetime well past the entire span of reproductive ages. Our extended survival makes most pronatal cultural traditions not only useless but positively harmful. At the same time, the inventiveness that extends our expected lifetimes has expanded and differentiated the bubble of culture in which we thrive, pluralizing the sources of our identity across institutional alternatives. Reproductive roles and relationships, once the essential core of social life, have become just one among many such sources of identity. The center of gravity among these alternatives is shifting towards our roles in economic production instead, though we're still a long way from any coherent, sustainable new equilibrium. Diverse cultures around the world right now are engaged in vast, tentative, multi-generational experiments seeking that new equilibrium, without any clear awareness that this is what they're doing. Some will encounter dead ends of ethnic chauvinism and demographic paranoia, like that which Russia's leaders appear to have chosen, situations that leave them with few, if any, good choices for the future. Some will cling to the old pronatal cultural machinery until resulting demographic imbalance overwhelms them with a rising tide of hungry children, environmental overload, and economic collapse, driving out their surplus populations as refugees onto the world stage. Some will embrace the eclipse of reproductive social order as a new age of personal freedoms, only to discover that corporate profits and government revenues were only the positive side of an economic balance sheet resting on a mirror universe of unpaid transfers motivated by the very reproductive relationships being eclipsed, so that people may no longer see sufficient reasons to make the sacrifices that produce future generations. I would like to leave you with one final image, one final perspective for coping with the complexity of the watershed transition now facing humanity. I would like you to visualize each society as the crew on board one of the great square-rigged sailing ships that plied the seven seas for centuries before the recent advent of engines powered by coal or oil or nuclear reactors. During that long age of sail, the crucial thing to know was which way the wind was blowing. When I left South Carolina to work at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, my daughters gave me a bon voyage card. On the cover of the card, I found these words: "We cannot direct the wind, but we can adjust our sails." For most of humanity's existence on Earth, we sailed against an offshore wind, against the fundamental demographic challenge of organizing ourselves to produce enough children to meet the gales of mortality that threaten to blow us out of sight of land and into extinction. We always had to fight to keep that demographic shoreline in sight. But today the wind has changed. Over the last few centuries, out of all those millennia, the offshore wind died away. Today we face the bane of every sea captain from the age of sail, an onshore wind of potential population growth that could, without careful navigation, blow us instead onto the jagged rocks of economic collapse or the sandbars of environmental disaster. The course ahead for humanity is not clear. Our experiments to find new balance among the many sources of identity available in our complex bubble of culture provide no clear conclusions yet. But whatever else we decide to do as we sail into the future, we always need to keep one eye on the sky and set our sails so that we can keep to a constructive course. As always, the crucial thing to know in that future will be which way the demographic wind is blowing. If you want to know which way the wind is blowing and how to adjust the rigging accordingly, you'll always need a demographer on board.